For 300 years, a fortress has stood guard at the mouth of the Niagara River in western New York. From French traders to British redcoats and American soldiers, Old Fort Niagara has seen empires rise and fall in the struggle for the control of North America. Boasting 6 original 18th century structures, it's a unique surviving window into our historical past. Welcome to Prime and Load. My name is Lee Gugino, and today I'm joined by Drs. Alex Burns and Andrew Bamford. Today the tables are turned a little bit. I grew up in the shadow of Fort Niagara. I spent my summers playing there as a kid, and I used to work there in college. So I'm going to give you all an insider's look into one of America's most unique historic sites as it celebrates its 300th birthday. Thank you for joining us for a special episode on Old Fort Niagara.
I'm Alex Burns here with Andrew Bamford and Lee Gugino, and today we have an episode on America's real colonial fort, Old Fort Niagara. Old Fort Niagara is turning 300 years old this year, and a longtime friend of the fort is going to tell us a little bit about it. Lee, what is Fort Niagara?
Yeah, so it first off, it is interesting to be on the kind of the other end of things on this one. Usually I'm asking the questions, but so yeah, Fort Niagara. Fort Niagara is a historic site in western New York, probably about as far away from New York City as you can get, while still staying in New York, right on the Niagara River, and it's pretty unique. I'm biased. I grew up in the area, and it's a longtime favorite place. Spent a whole lot of childhood summers running around there, but I do think it is a very unique place. It's got 6 surviving 18th century structures all in one site. You know, being a podcast about the 18th century, I feel like we can't really let this one kind of waltz by us without at least giving some sort of nod to it.
So, Lee, obviously, this key to a continent is a site of perpetual interest, but why are we talking about it right now here in 2026?
Sure. So the reason we're talking about Fort Niagara today is because it is turning 300 years old, and with the exception of some places in Florida, places in Massachusetts like Plymouth, there's not a whole lot of places in the U.S. that are that old. Having the concentration of historic buildings in one spot is very unique. But the main structure at Fort Niagara, what we call today is the French Castle. It's not what they called it in the period, but that building is turning 300 years old this year. And there's a lot of 250th stuff going on, which is wonderful, and we love that history as well. But we would hate for this anniversary to kind of go under the radar with all the other 250th stuff, which again is great. But you know, this is another aspect that is really, 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 really interesting.
And just before I turn it over to Andrew, can I ask a follow-up question? So, what time in the year in 1726 are they putting stuff down? Like is this the summer? Is it like the spring? Like when actually is this anniversary?
So the negotiations with the native peoples in this area begin in the early spring, March time, but it isn't until July that they actually start building the structure of the castle, quotes castle. And so that's it is happening in the summertime, and we can talk about it a little bit more, but it is pretty surprising, at least to me, how quickly they do actually get it done. So they begin construction in the summer of 1726, and they're garrisoning the post by that winter. A cold Niagara winter is a powerful motivator.
So they then are the French, if it's the French castle. So why are they so interested in this part of the world? What's so important? I mean, you've mentioned that there are native peoples already in the area. So how does that dynamic play out, and why is there a need for a fort?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So to explain why a fort at Niagara is important, you kind of have to back up a little bit. One of the things we have to acknowledge that I think we might kind of forget sometimes is in the 18th century and the 17th century, North America is an enormously vast continent. One of the only really efficient ways to do any sort of meaningful travel or logistical operations is by water in North America. And one of the really important waterways is on the Great Lakes. So from the Great Lakes through the St. Lawrence out to the ocean. If you can control that waterway, you can control a lot of the movement into the interior of North America. So it's from the ocean to the furthest westward portion of the Great Lakes. It's, roughly 1,400 miles. So that's a big expanse. And so to be able to control that, you need to control that highway into the interior of North America. About 500 miles, if you're going from east to west, you get this bottleneck between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, the Niagara River. And in the middle of the Niagara River, there's a fairly substantial obstacle. It's called Niagara Falls. And for those who haven't been able to visit the falls, it's about 150 foot high cliff with something like 40 million gallons of water going over the edge every minute. It's enormous. It's interesting that my wife and I were in Scotland. She was doing a research trip and we were in an art gallery and they had a painting of Niagara Falls. And we said, oh, that looks familiar. And the people in front of us were just kind of, nah, they can't really be that big. I promise you, it is that big. Now, obviously you're not paddling or sailing up the falls. So what native peoples do and have been doing for generations is what's known as portaging. And that's when you land your canoe or your vessel, you take everything out of it, put it on your back, and walk around the obstacle. And this does happen at several points, especially along the St. Lawrence as you're coming into the Great Lakes. But this is a significant one because of the obstacle that you're circumnavigating. And that bottleneck, that portage around the falls is incredibly strategic for anybody who wants to control westward travel into the Great Lakes and open up the interior of the continent. If you're a determined traveler, you can go from the ocean to the St. Lawrence to the Great Lakes. You could even get into the Ohio, into the Mississippi, and really the continent comes open to you. Now, I don't want to make that seem like this is an easy journey by any stretch of the imagination, but it is possible, and it's a heck of a lot better than trying to do it on foot. Anyone who can control that, again, opens up westward travel for trade, for military operations. So that's why this area is so important at this time period specifically.
And so, Lee, like waterborne transport is a lot easier than trying to put stuff in carts or on the backs of mules or something like this. And can you just, maybe it is incredibly obvious to listeners, but like, why do Europeans want to get into the heart of the continent? Like, what is especially in the Great Lakes region, like what is the big business that is driving a lot of this French desire to control these waterways in, 1670s through the 1720s?
Sure. So we did talk about how I mentioned North America is an incredibly vast place, right? But it is not an empty place. There's peoples that live there, and if you can get in contact with those peoples, you can do something that people have been doing since the dawn of time. We can make money. We can trade with these people. We can open up diplomatic relationships. They can be allies in war. economic partners. So really what French, English, Spanish, Dutch, what all these European countries want to do is open up the continent to trade. And that means getting one of the big ticket items is beaver furs. Those furs can be harvested out of the interior of the continent by native peoples, traded with European traders or agents. They can sell products made in Europe to these native peoples. They can bring those furs back to Europe and be sold on the open market. So there's a huge trade and money-making opportunity if you can open these markets. Even though, obviously, as we know, there's a lot of tensions with native peoples and Europeans and, some unsavory viewpoints, but opening up trade is the big motivation.
Hello listeners, this is Andrew. We often say that history is written by the victors, but on this show we know it's actually written by the supply lines, by the weather, and by the difficult decisions made inside the command tent. Sometimes the most interesting part of our recording session isn't the battle narrative. It's the 20-minute debate or analysis we have between the key actions. If you enjoy those what-if moments, I invite you to become part of the Prime and Load War Room on Patreon. For the price of a pint, you can hear the conversations that usually end up on the cutting room floor. You'll also get access to our newsletter, The Orderly Book, as well as exclusive bonus episodes that cover topics we typically don't get to on the main show. So if you're the kind of person who's looking for more 18th century warfare, join the Prime and Load War Room at patreon.com/primeandload.
Because all of those three-cornered hats are not going to make themselves. We've got to get the beaver pelts and make them into three-cornered hats. Okay, yeah, all right, delightful. Yep. Good. Andrew, you want to continue?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm. This is the ignorant Brit question. So, the native peoples presumably are on side for the most part because they're making money selling furs to the French. If the British want to come a looting and a pirating and a trading, before they get to Fort Niagara, they've got to come up the centre and they've got to get past Louisbourg, they've got to get past Quebec, they've got to get past Montreal. There are quite a few choke points before you even get to Niagara. So who is the threat, if you like? I mean, are there people coming overland from what's now the US, from the American colonies, the British American colonies? Is that who it's essentially built to guard against?
So initially, when the French first, kind of get their toehold at Niagara, the big threat is the local native peoples. Throughout the 17th century, the French and the local natives have not been getting along well. There's been a lot of conflicts between French, their native allies, and their allies' enemies. So that's the first major one. That evolves a little bit as the 13 English colonies do expand. Really, the English aren't necessarily trying to go from the ocean through Louisbourg and go up past all that because of the difficulty that you alluded to in doing something like that. In New York, the colony of New York, really the threat is coming from the British, coming from Albany and then across what is today New York State, getting their kind of toehold into Lake Ontario, and then from Lake Ontario kind of branching out into the Great Lakes. So kind of a back road to the Great Lakes. It's more difficult of a path, but if the English can get their toehold there, they can do more later. And so this is a big motivator for the French to really solidify their control of Niagara. But it isn't until the 1720s, after those native relations have gotten a bit better, and the encroachment of the English, they've really, hey, we're going to give this another shot. And that's when they do build the French castle in the early part of the 18th century. So the encroachment of the English is the next big threat after native peoples.
So you've mentioned Lee's relations with the native peoples have been variously very bad, very good, somewhere in between. So who are the key native players in this part of the world?
Sure. I think this is another one where I've got to kind of take a bit of a big picture first and talk about how native diplomacy is a very complex issue at this time period for many reasons. But I think one of the biggest ones is that there are so many different people and nations, not just in this area, but all over North America. And I think that's, again, one of the things that makes us very complex is just because we like to think of Native Americans as kind of a nice, neat group of people, like maybe the French or the English. But Native peoples, when we talk about Europeans met with the Native peoples and did this, it's kind of a loaded term. And I'm not trying to be an expert on that. It's an incredibly complex topic. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to focus for this story, just focus on the ones that are probably the most influential in Niagara's history for the very long history the fort has. There's more people that are involved. There's more people that are influential, but the ones that exert the most control over this area are the Haudenosaunee people. And they are a confederacy of 5, later 6 nations. We have the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, Tuscarora, Mohawk, Oneida. And so what becomes difficult is when we talk about the Haudenosaunee, they do operate as a cohesive confederacy, but at the same time, one nation may not feel the same way as another nation. And some groups in that same nation might have different goals, objectives based on what European powers live next to them, what resources they have available to them. So again, this is kind of what makes things kind of tricky when we come and talk about native diplomacy. And so the people that actually live in the area that Niagara is located are the Seneca. They're the keepers of the western door. They're the furthest west nation. And they're influential because they're the ones that essentially control the portage, allow or not allow peoples to navigate through it. Later on, they'll do a lot of, the Seneca will actually, for a fee, help you portage around the falls, which is a big economic boom for that nation. They never actually have a settlement at the mouth of the Niagara River where Fort Niagara is actually end up being built, but it is an important fishing and hunting ground. But there is no village there at the mouth of the river. It's a very beautiful area. It's where I would want to put a village, but historically there's no permanent settlement on that site.
No settlement until the French decide to build something then, which sort of begs the question of what it is they build. I mean, you've called it the French Castle a couple of times, which, as you say, is a modern name rather than a contemporary one. And I'm assuming we're not talking about a castle in the way I might imagine a European castle. So what is it that they build in the first instance 300 years ago? So originally the French, they looked to get permission from the Haudenosaunee to build a structure on the Niagara River in general. The original thought is not to put it where they end up putting it, but they do go and try and seek some approval from the Haudenosaunee. The Governor Longueuil, he's governor of Montreal, he goes to Onondaga, even though where he wants to build the fort is in the land of the Seneca. He goes to Onondaga where the central council fire is, and at a council that is sparsely attended, he makes a pitch to say, hey, we need to replace this old, dilapidated wooden storehouse with a new stone trading house. And initially, the Onondaga give their blessing. Accounts say there's only 2 representatives from the Seneca there, and they don't want it to happen. The Seneca specifically they're the ones that had tensions with the French in the past. So they're not really keen to let the French build a stone structure in their lands.
but Longueuil's got a little bit more pull with the Onondaga. So he's able to actually gain permission and get this project kind of rolling. And so they've got the permission. And like I said at the beginning, very quickly, they send a party of about 100 soldiers and workmen. And initially they want to replace the trading house that is at the foot of the escarpment on the Niagara River, where the modern village of Lewiston is. They think you can pull a boat up, keep it under the cover of the guns of the fort, everything will be happy. The chief engineer of New France, Deliri, he kind of at the last second kind of calls an audible. And he says, if we put the fort at the base of the escarpment, which is about 6-ish miles upriver from the mouth of the lake, if we put it there, all the English need to do is sail up and kind of blockade the river, the mouth of the river, and now there's no point of us having built a fort there. So he makes the decision to move the location to the mouth of the Niagara River, where it empties into Lake Ontario. And right at that peninsula, there's 30-foot bluffs that give you a good elevation above the water level. So you get a great view of kind of what's coming up the lake and what's going down the lake. And so the fort ends up being a little bit removed from the actual start of the portage, but tactically, you could make the argument it is a better place. This does become a problem later on, and we can talk about that later. But what the French actually end up building is, again, what they refer to as a stone house that's only meant for trade goods on paper, but they build one heck of a storehouse. It ends up being what I understand to be a fairly typical French barracks building. It's got 4-foot thick stone walls. It's 2 stone levels and then a wooden deck with a wooden roof on top. And on that top deck, it has machicolated dormers, which they kind of stick out over the face of the building. So you can shoot down or drop heavy items on anybody trying to attack your structure. And that is, in the period, that's what it's called, the Maison du Machicolas, or the machicolated house. And this building houses everything that a garrison needs. It has barracks rooms. It has a well. It has a powder magazine. It has a bake oven in it. It's got housing for officers. It's got a storeroom for trade goods. So really, if this building needed to kind of seal itself up, it can do that and hold out for a pretty good length of time. And that's exactly the point. Trade is still important here, but really it is a structure to withstand any native attack at all, ever. This thing is a tough nut to crack for any force that does not have European style artillery, which native peoples do not have. Now, during the building, I think it's also important to note, during the building, a Seneca delegation does come to Niagara and encounters Deliri and says, hey guys, we did not okay this. I'm paraphrasing. Even the Onondaga say also, like, maybe we were too hasty. We kind of gave permission that wasn't ours to give. And the Seneca, they offer Deliri a belt of wampum in protest. And Deliri does something kind of unique. He takes it, folds it up, and puts it back in the delegate's bag, or the sachem's bag, basically saying, I'm not taking this. I'm not accepting it. And I think you're just here because the English are saying this to you. We're going to go with the last thing you said. So essentially he ignores the Seneca and just continues on with the work. So to say that I guess they did on black and white get permission to build this stone house. That's, at the beginning I said it was very dubious permission. So I think it's pretty safe to say that this was done not with great cooperation or a lot of friendly feelings. With that being said, trade is still done at Niagara. There's still some benefit being gleaned by the Seneca from the French being there. The French are able to maintain good relations with the Seneca despite this.
And so just to return to Andrew's initial question about the house, I mean, I do kind of associate the building of structures, if it's called, the Maison Machicolas, right? I mean, that's how castles are built. Like that's the part of the castle that allows you to drop rocks on people. So maybe it's even in the term for it, it's designed to be a defensive house. It's designed to be a house that is not only there for trade, but is also protecting the French from the native people who are probably irate that they are building this defensive house on their land.
Yes, certainly. There's no doubt that this is, from its outset, meant to be a military fortress that also does trade. If you just look at the thing that it's supposedly replacing, it was a wooden warehouse. This is several orders of magnitude beyond that. And I think it also shows clearly that Delirium kind of knows, or maybe expects, that there might be some fallout from this diplomatic angling, let's call it. If I knew that I was doing something kind of seedy, maybe I would make my stone walls a little thicker.
Just to be clear in the sort of mental picture of what we're looking at here, then, so there's no outer stockade or ramparts or anything like that. It's purely a whacking grit stone building, and if somebody comes to attack it, you close the door and bar the windows and throw things from the roof. That's the concept at this stage.
At the very, very earliest stages, yes. There is a map that shows a 2 layers of stockade walls outside the fort. So, but at this very early stage, it is the castle, Maison du Machicolas, and I would say safe to say a wooden palisade around it, at least one, possibly 2. But that's the idea, is that palisade is probably going to be breached pretty quickly, and then we can just seal ourselves up. There is no substantial attack in that very, very early stage, or there's no attack in that very early stage of the fort's history, though. So I guess Delirium didn't have to suffer the fallout from his diplomacy. Again, in that early stage.
And you very nicely set up what was going to be my next question, because you've mentioned the garrison. You say 40 men and a priest. So we talk about the priest and the religious element as well, but I mean, who are the 40 men who've been presumably given the short straw and told to get themselves some way into the wilderness and garrison this place?
Yeah. So Fort Niagara is built and garrisoned by French Marines, and these guys are part of the Compagnie Franche de la Marine, and they are Marines, not necessarily in the sense like that we think of Marines today, like ship to shore. That obviously France does have those troops, but these ones specifically are recruited for service in the colony of Canada. And so they're recruited in France, they're brought over across the ocean, and they land in Quebec, and they get almost like a middle school dodgeball draft picked by the different independent commanders of these independent companies, or a representative of those commanders. And wherever that commander is at the time, like, all right, hey, you 3 guys got picked, you got to get on another boat. And so these guys, like I said, they're recruited specifically for Canada. If they're lucky enough to get chosen to come to Niagara, they're going to get on another boat, make their way up the St. Lawrence through Lake Ontario to Niagara. And at this early stage, it's about, the initial working party is about 100 men, soldiers and workmen. But the garrison after that is about 40 to 60 of these French Marines, along with some civilians. At the very early stages, we do know there's a Jesuit priest to see to the spiritual welfare of the troops. He has his own chapel inside the fort. There's also a trade agent who's there to regulate and administer the trade on behalf of the king. Throughout Niagara's history, the trade at Niagara is kind of on again, off again. At this point, the king, through his agents, regulates the trade out of Niagara. So he has an agent there who administers that. We do know at certain points there are women there, not really at this early stage that we know much of. It isn't until a little later on that we know the commandant's daughters are there. He has a servant there. But again, very early stage, 40 to 60 soldiers, trade agent, priest.
And how does all that evolve then over time? So you mentioned there's no immediate attack, so I'm assuming it grows as a trading post. I mean, are there changes to the garrison? Are there changes to the fort as we move on through the 18th century?
Yeah. As time moves on, Niagara's role, it's a story of changing roles and evolving responsibilities. At this early stage, when it's first built, it's meant to really solidify French control of the area. And it does that very well. So it firmly plants France in control of this area. New Yorkers are furious about it, but there's not a whole lot they can do. As time moves on, and we get into the 1740s, France is looking to do exactly what its intent of getting its foothold at Niagara was, is to push westward. Niagara becomes a very integral part of that supply chain and that logistics train out into the west. I'm sure many of our listeners know about the struggle for the Ohio country. In the 40s, it's diplomatic, kind of almost a Cold War. If we can get men and material and supplies out there, now we can establish dominance further west and kind of do that leapfrogging. So the men that go and establish Fort Duquesne, they are at Niagara. They're not stationed there. They're transitory troops. But what that means is Niagara has to grow. They build barracks. They build a bakehouse, which is still there today. They build storehouses as well. Because the idea is, just like the modern conflicts today, we've got like a Camp Leatherneck where everybody comes into Leatherneck. Doesn't mean you're stationed there. You're there for a little bit. You rest, refit, resupply, and then you go to where you're actually needed. Fort Niagara occupies that role in a pretty major way. It's far outside of the center of gravity of New France, up on the St. Lawrence, Quebec, Montreal, Trois-Rivières. So it's out kind of at the far reaches, but it is an established post where you can rest, refit, resupply. So Fort Niagara does grow, but that doesn't mean that it's getting necessarily the attention it needs. Like many military posts during times of peace, it is falling into some decay. The palisades around the fort are starting to rot. They do have barracks buildings, but they're not great either. They're not being well maintained. The garrison is kind of lackadaisical. There's reports about how the garrison is afraid to fire its cannon because they feel like the palisade walls will come crumbling down around them. And that's, not a great tactical situation to be in. So Niagara is mounting the responsibility of that logistics train, but is not necessarily getting the support to do it safely and efficiently, I guess is the best way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, my impression is New France is to some extent a colonial on a shoestring. As far as France is concerned, there are more important things in Versailles. So yeah, if you're the forgotten stepchild of a colony that is itself a forgotten stepchild, then you're probably not going to do brilliantly. But those ambitions that you talked about, obviously, they do eventually lead to a major war, to the 7 Years' War, the French Indian War, which in its North American guise we haven't really talked about a great deal on the podcast so far, but I'm assuming by its location, Fort Niagara is going to play a key role in this conflict. Do you want to take us through what happens when war does come knocking?
Yeah. So again, like I alluded, Niagara it's an ebb and flow throughout its history. Peacetime, we forget about it. Wartime, everything spikes. And that's exactly what happens. When hostilities do break out, the governor of New France is very aware that Niagara is vulnerable from the very early stages of the war. And so solidifying Niagara becomes very important because the fort is built with the intent of stopping native peoples, right? An enemy with artillery is not anticipated at the early stages of Niagara. Now, this is 30 years removed from its initial construction. The threat of an artillery-armed enemy is present. So we've got to take that into account. And what happens is the governor of New France sends probably the most influential person on Niagara in its entire history. He sends Captain Pierre Pouchot to Niagara in 1755. Pouchot's fingerprints are still all over Niagara even today. He's a really interesting character. When he comes to Niagara, he's about 40 years old. He is a captain in the Béarn regiment. So Pouchot is on the regular French army side of this equation, and he has experience. He's been in combat. He's been at war several times in Europe. He's been through several sieges. So he's not, a nobody who doesn't know anything. So he is sent to Niagara specifically because he has knowledge of engineering. He's not an engineer, but he comes to Niagara because he's got this ability. He's done work strengthening the defenses around Quebec, and that's kind of how he catches the Governor Vaudreuil's eye. So he sends him to Niagara knowing Niagara needs some work. And so what Pouchot does there is takes this kind of rickety frontier fort and turns it into a Vauban-style fortress out in the middle of nowhere. Now he's got a lot of help. He's 3/4 of the fort are water, so you really only have a little sliver to do earthworks thing. So he's got a bit of an easier job of it, but makes a glacis, lunettes, big hornwork, and he also expands the number of troops that actually be quartered at Niagara. He builds a powder magazine. He builds more storehouses, more barracks buildings. They rearm Niagara. Niagara is only outclassed in armament by Montreal and Quebec, the two other major metro areas in New France. And he really makes Niagara, in the span of about a year and a half, makes Niagara an incredibly powerful fortress right under the nose of the English. The English are still under the idea that this piddly little thing, if you come over and push against the wall, it's all going to come crumbling down. By 1756, Pouchot is able to send a report saying, this is a report and a map showing all of the works. And Vaudreuil and later Montcalm both comment that, Pouchot has really made a pretty great, strong fortress here that is really kind of up to snuff. So that role, link in the supply chain, is now kind of met by the tactical capabilities of Niagara now, post Pouchot arriving.
And so, Lee, if I could kind of jump in real fast on that point. So I've spent some time when I was over in England and subsequently looking at His Royal Highness the Duke of Cumberland's papers. And in the years between 1750 and 1755, he's kind of obsessed with Niagara as like one of the principal places that the British Army would have to go take in North America. And so one of the reports that he gets from like a basically a spy in North America reads, sort of talking about Pouchot's improvements, the Fort Niagara before the year 1749 was only built of logs palisaded, but since that time has been made a strong and regular fortification of stone. And so, like, the British are aware. They're kind of looking at this key to a continent with a great deal of skepticism as Pouchot was making all of these improvements. And I mean, it's in some ways, obviously, we tell the story of the French and Indian War at its beginning as like a squaring off over Pittsburgh. But if you look at what Cumberland is paying attention to in 1750 and 51 and 52, he's very focused on Niagara. He does kind of view this, I think, as a key to the continent. So could you walk us through a little bit about what actually happens in the fighting of the 7 Years' War? Pouchot's made a very strong fortress. What are the British going to do about it?
To your point, Alex, that the threat of Niagara is very clear. Even Braddock, in his orders, he detaches Governor William Shirley, to, hey, we've got to get Niagara because this place is central to French war efforts. If we can, kind of cut off Niagara, everything along the vine will wither. So this is next to Braddock's personal mission to go out to Duquesne. Niagara is the next one on the list. So in 1755, Governor William Shirley is tasked with going on an expedition to conquer Niagara at this kind of early stage before Niagara's really ready. And by the time he's making his way out there, the improvements are happening. I think it's kind of one of those, it'd be fun to think, what if Shirley had actually gotten to Niagara at that critical stage? What would have happened? But ultimately, that expedition gets to Oswego, which is further east where the Oswego River empties into the lake. That's where the English do set up a trading post, and that's where Shirley is able to get to, but that's as far as he goes. Then that fort in 57 is taken by Montcalm, with Pouchot acting as the engineer on that expedition as well. So that kind of is the first action against Niagara, and the last one until much later. It isn't until 1759 that the British attempt to go back to Niagara. And I don't want to say, like most people know who's listening, but I would say it's probably pretty strong. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably know the basic big blue arrows of the French and Indian War. By 1759, things have shifted quite a bit. Early on, the French are doing pretty well. At this point, not so much. 1758 is kind of a turning point in the war. And the British are really looking to kind of finish New France off. And so they come up with this three-pronged strategy with Wolfe going to Quebec, Amherst coming up the Lake Champlain corridor. And part of that is another expedition westward towards Niagara. John Prideaux, who's put in charge of this westward expedition, once Niagara is reduced, that he does go up the lake and assist that same summer in the assault on Montreal. That's a lot of ground to cover, even if you assume everything goes perfectly. But anyway, Prideaux is tasked to depart from Albany across New York, reestablish Oswego, which a few years earlier had been burned, then go to Niagara, take Niagara, easy peasy, obviously, and move on with the campaign. The British get to Niagara in the summer of 1759, and they conduct a 19-day siege of the fort, and they do win. It is a very close run match. At several points, the English or the British Army, their garbage engineers are exactly as advertised and are awful. If you've ever seen images or engravings of siege works, how they zigzag towards the fortress, the English do not do that very well. And so at certain points, they're digging straight at the fort. So the French can just lob cannonballs right down like a bowling alley. And one day, The 3 ranking officers of the British Army, to include Pouchot himself, are all killed in one day. I'm sorry, 2 are killed. 1 is wounded and taken out of the engagement. So their entire command structure is raked through in one day. Then there is a short power struggle to see who's going to command. Ultimately, it is William Johnson, that Indian agent who convinced the Haudenosaunee. Yeah, boo William Johnson.
I'm sorry. This is airy mass erasure. Like what? Like, are you not even going to talk about him?
Oh, the next piece of this.
All right.
There is a relief column that does attempt to come to Niagara. You know, as soon as they hear Niagara is besieged, they hightail it up to Niagara because they know if Niagara falls, like we've said earlier, everything else on the vine will wither. So there's a culminating battle about a mile outside the fort where Lieutenant Colonel Aaron Massey, who also reportedly is a massive jerk, but we can go down that another time. He leads the counterattack on this, or ambush on this French relief column. That's a 30-minute bloody battle outside the fort, and really kind of seals the fate of Niagara. Niagara does a very good job of withstanding this British siege, but once the relief column, like any fortress, the goal is to hold out until relief comes. Once that relief is defeated, you don't really have much to go on after that. So after 19 days, the French do surrender, and a lot of them that garrison are taken to New York and Connecticut areas. But from there, Fort Niagara shifts to the British control. And it pains me to gloss over it. Maybe someday we'll have to do an episode just on the 1759 siege, because like I said before, it's got the ebbs and flows of the best HBO miniseries ever.
Wasn't there like a movie where Pierce Brosnan played Sir William Johnson at the siege? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. In that movie also, there's a shot of the French castle, and then when you walk in, it's the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. So, I mean, it. You know,
name of movie is.
Oh, what is it? We literally just got a DVD of it.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Pathfinder, I think.
Okay. Right.
We'll have to put that like on our Patreon store or something.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's an incredibly interesting siege that just has it's the coolest thing. And like I said, we'll do a bonus episode or something on it. But 1759, the fort changes ownership for the first time. So it was French and is now in British control.
How does Fort Niagara's role in British imperial policy change when we move into the period of the American Revolution? Like, what role does Niagara play in that conflict?
So when the American Revolution starts, obviously the British are there prior to the start. Niagara now is growing again because we're not in peacetime anymore. Now we've come into a new conflict. So more buildings get built, buildings get refurbished, earthworks get revitalized. But the role of Niagara, it's not that it isn't prepared for combat. It is. It just combat never comes to Niagara during the course of the American Revolution. But what Niagara does kind of shoulder is the responsibility of Western power projection, right? So what Niagara is the command post of what are referred to as the upper posts. And the upper posts include all of the major installations along the Great Lakes. So the furthest east, you have Oswegatchie, which is kind of up where Lake Ontario feeds into the St. Lawrence. Then you have Niagara. Then you've got Detroit. You have Michilimackinac all the way at the tip of Michigan. So this is like a 500-mile spread, right? Fort Niagara is the command post for all of those positions. All of those positions report back to Niagara. The commander at Niagara is the lieutenant colonel of the regiment that is the main garrison for those posts. But on top of that, any trade that is happening with Native peoples is headquartered out of Niagara. The diplomacy efforts are headed out of Niagara. The governor of Canada has a direct line of communication with the commander at Niagara. The commandant there, he's also in charge of all naval operations being done on Lake Ontario. So the commandant of Niagara has a lot on his plate because of the importance of that position. So the other big thing Niagara does during the war is in 1779. During that year, the main effort of the Continental Army is headed by Generals Clinton and Sullivan with orders from Washington to go through New York and essentially push the Haudenosaunee out of the war by making it too materially costly to continue their support for the English. This means burning villages, burning crops, and dispersing and essentially killing and terrorizing as many of the Haudenosaunee people as possible to the point where they just throw in the towel and they don't want to participate. Now, there's a bunch of reasons for this. The Haudenosaunee have been a staunch ally of the British during this time. They've been a huge thorn to the Americans by conducting raids into the breadbasket of the colonies and harassing supply chains. I'm not trying to allude that makes this campaign or expedition justifiable by any means, but it's the situation that Washington is dealing with. So he dispatches these commanders to essentially slash and burn through the country of the Iroquois. The fallout from that is there are thousands and thousands and thousands of displaced peoples, native and white settlers, people who are or have alleged sympathies for the king, right? Where are these displaced peoples going to go? They're going to go to Niagara, and thousands of them do. And so the garrison at Niagara in the winters of 79 to 80 are faced with a refugee village outside the walls of the fort of upwards of 2,000 people. The fort is already overpopulated, and they're only at about 800 at that time. And they're faced with 2,000 civilians sitting outside of their walls. So what the British do that following spring was take all of these refugees who have nothing and are itching for revenge, and they organize them, and they turn them into loyalist units like Butler's Rangers, Brant's Volunteers, and they send them back to raid their former homes. And that's a massive logistical outfitting that Niagara does during this war. So there's no combat at the fort like there is in the French-Indian War, but Fort Niagara becomes a major resupply and logistical and command hub for power projection into the West and into the frontiers of the 13 colonies.
And so when the war ends, Niagara is part of a territory that's supposed to be given over to the United States. Does that actually happen? Like, what does that look like?
So it takes some time and negotiation to actually make the Niagara River the border between what is then Upper Canada and the state of New York. That doesn't happen until 1796, when an American garrison actually occupies Niagara. In the intervening time between the war ending and the Americans taking over, essentially the British just stop, because they see the writing on the wall, like, this is going to happen. So why would we improve this fort? Why would we build new buildings? Why would we maintain it other than just being able to live here? And so when the Americans take over, again, we're in that ebb and flow. Fort Niagara is in kind of disrepair and not really well looked after. The British have their eyes across the river. Upper Canada, that's still British territory. So what the British do is they kind of leave Niagara to its, to do what it's going to do. They cross the river, build Fort George, and that's where the British will try to exert power over the region from 3/4 of a mile across the river. And, very nice a place you can see it. If you're in Fort Niagara, you can look across the river and you can see they've got a big British flag on a flagpole, and it's not hiding. It's right out there. It's 3/4 of a mile away. And so the British basically do exactly, they I don't want to say they duplicate it because it's a different, the fort's shaped differently, but tactically and strategically, they just take their position and plop it on the other side of the river to kind of keep an eye on this new American garrison that's staying there.
And so between these two forts, is there like, is one larger? Is one on higher ground? Like what is the kind of the relationship, in a tactical and operational setting, between these two locations?
Yeah. So the British certainly have the advantage because they're building the fort in response to a position that's already there, right? Pouchot's earthworks and the defense of the fort is facing landward, like towards the land approaches of the fort. Because prior to this late 18th century, early 19th century, there's no substantial waterborne threat because you have to build a navy on the lakes for there to be a threat. And that is an enormous undertaking, So the threat is coming from the land, right? So that's where all of Niagara's defenses are facing. But if you can cross the river, find a little bit higher elevation, build a fort that can now essentially kind of look up the skirt of Niagara, you've got them dead to rights. And that's exactly what the British do. So Fort George is slightly elevated from Niagara and facing its backside. So it's really put that new American garrison in a tight spot. They do build their walls a little higher on the river side of the fort, but they don't have land to build earthworks, right? So it's literally just a facade stone wall that makes it a little higher. And really, when we're talking about artillery at this time, like it's essentially a screen, so you can't see inside the fort, which kind of works. So as far as advantage, disadvantage, all the cards at this point are in Fort George's hand. Really, it does not take a lot to just kind of like toss artillery rounds into the parade ground. You've got good fields of fire. You can reach out and touch any corner of Niagara at this point.
And so when conflict resumes in 1812, what does that look like? I mean, I know that's maybe a little bit beyond the scope of this podcast, but briefly run down for us what happens in the War of 1812.
Yeah, so when war comes again in 1812, it's a war that people are not prepared for in North America, especially so on the Niagara frontier. People have family on both sides. People do business on both sides. Nobody in Niagara wants a war with their neighbors. And I think this is exemplified in no better story. I mean, it's a true story that when word finally gets to Fort George that the U.S. and Britain are at war, General Brock is sitting down to dinner with the command of Fort Niagara. So the American officers are sitting at the table with Brock when he gets word that war's been declared. And as the story goes, graciously said, let's not let this ruin a good dinner. Very, very British. Sorry, Andrew. It's a beloved story here, but
on behalf of my country, I accept. What can I say? We get gentlemen under extreme circumstances.
It's appreciated, but they do allow the garrison, the officers to go back to Niagara, and we'll start the war tomorrow. So war does happen, and obviously this border becomes instantly a massive kind of hot zone, right? Very early in the war, there's the Battle of Queenston Heights, where the American army at Niagara and stretched along the river, kind of like the British did in the 1760s. They invade Canada, or an attempt invasion of Canada. That invasion fails. The gracious General Brock is killed. in that engagement, to the dismay of many. They've got a lot of monuments over there to him. Just don't read his papers too closely, because it'll talk about how much he doesn't want to be in Canada. Just throwing it out there. But
and he was a junior officer in the King's Regiment back in the 80s, right? So he's been in this frontier zone forever.
Yeah. He's okay. I don't know about how long. Like, I don't know if he's a holdover from. Like, I don't know if he was at Niagara prior to this. Sure. But he was in the King's Regiment. That's the regiment that was in those upper posts during the American Revolution. But this attempted invasion fails. After that, there in November of 1812, there's an artillery duel between Fort George and Fort Niagara, which I can only assume is like an artilleryman's just like fantasy. Just dueling with big cannons for artillery, point blank range, 3/4 of a mile.
You don't even have to leave the fort.
You don't even have to
besiege the other fort from the convenience of your own fort.
It's all the cool of artillery without any of the working parties. I mean, how could you hate it? But this is a 12-hour bombardment between Fort George and Fort Niagara, and they are hurling cannonballs at each other back and forth. And there's references to people living in Buffalo, which is about a 45-minute drive south, in a car. They're able to hear the bombardment for 12 hours. So this is a very heavy bombardment. Niagara gets their nose bloodied pretty substantially because of all of the tactical disadvantages that we talked about earlier. But this spurs some good old American ingenuity. And what the American garrison does is they strip the roofs off of all of the buildings, to include the French castle, the one that's, was built, in the 1720s. They take the roofs off, they bring a bunch of dirt on the top of these buildings, and then they haul guns up to the top and build batteries on the two redoubts and the French castle. So now the American gunners have the advantage on the British gunners. So the next time they face off, well, I mean, there's a reason Fort George is a reproduction and Niagara's not. There's more players in that game as well. But the gunners at Niagara, along with an American fleet out in Lake Ontario and batteries along the river, all support a second invasion of Canada. And this one temporarily sticks. And Fort George is burned, and the Americans are able to get a foothold in Canada for a while until they're pushed back. And in December of 1813, when that invasion eventually creeps its way back, the antsy American militia that are in charge of Fort George burn the town of Newark and then hightail it back across the river. British obviously not too stoked about that. So on the 13th of December, they cross the river and they attack Fort Niagara with bayonets. And in about 30 minutes, they take the garrison off guard and they capture Fort Niagara. And another column heads south, burns the village of Lewiston, and another column burns the city of Buffalo, and really leaves that Niagara frontier in ashes. And that pretty much ends the contest on the Niagara frontier. After the war, everything is repatriated back to the Americans. Fort Niagara becomes an American garrison again. And like we talked about the changing roles of Niagara. Niagara is not decommissioned. The garrison takes over. It stays an active army post. And there is some additions to Niagara after the War of 1812. But as anybody who studied the American Civil War, in-placed fortifications aren't really viable anymore, right? As Fort Sumter is a perfect example of. So the role of Niagara changes again. The Canada U.S. border becomes one of the longest peaceful borders in history, right? So the idea of Niagara being a border fortress at the edge of conflict kind of goes away, right? So it changes its role.
And so can you just briefly walk us through what does more modern history at Niagara look like? I mean, it's still a military base all the way through the mid 20th century. What if it's not shooting cannons at Canada anymore? Knock on wood. What are we doing instead?
Yeah. So, like I said, Niagara changes roles, right? Its role as a combat outpost kind of goes away because of the nature of relations with Canada and the U.S. So Niagara takes on this role as a training base, right? Like just like Parris Island is it doesn't hold any maneuver units. It's a training installation. Niagara takes on some of those same responsibilities, right? The Spanish-American War, troops are stationed there and they train for Cuba. One of America's all-black regiments is also stationed at Niagara for a good chunk of time. And you can find Niagara Falls Gazette articles talking about how great it is to have them in the city, which is kind of cool and unique for the time period. There are soldiers, ROTC students who actually dig trenches in the same place that John Prideaux dug his trenches to train for World War I. Archaeologically, kind of a nightmare, but it's kind of poetic, right? So, future American officers train for France. During World War II, Fort Niagara is a massive in-processing base, right? My grandma's, her three brothers, when they're drafted, they all go through Fort Niagara to be processed into the Army. Fort Niagara also is the command center for POW camps that go all over, that span all over New York. So members of Rommel's Africa Corps are at Fort Niagara for the remainder. Some members of the Italian Army are also there as POWs. After the war, during the Cold War, Fort Niagara is a command center for Nike missile batteries. The idea being these are surface-to-air missiles that are going to shoot down the Ruskies as they, fly over North America. So Fort Niagara is not decommissioned as an active military site until 1963. So I think that's one of the other things that makes Niagara unique, right? From 1726 all the way until 1963, there is an active military presence there, either maneuver combat units or training, processing, and supply network, support units there. So that's that breadth of history. If there's something you're interested in history, Niagara probably has its fingers in it at some point. It's almost like a 7 Degrees of Kevin Bacon situation. So in the 1920s, there is a unique relationship between the local community and the active duty Army garrison at Niagara, who at that point, that old part of the fort is starting to fall into disarray. And there's a concerted effort between the Army garrison and the local community to restore that area as a tourist site. And so the local community creates the Old Fort Niagara Association. And again, in cooperation with the active duty Army commander, they raise funds, restore the buildings, and operate the site as a tourist destination, as a historic site. And they do that till today. The Fort Niagara Association still operates the private nonprofit inside of the state park. But it's a really unique civilian and military cooperation to preserve a place that might have very easily have fallen into the lake.
And so today, Fort Niagara is a center of tourism. Can you tell us about some of what is a calendar year at Niagara look like? Like, what are some of the highlight moments in the year? If you're thinking, oh my gosh, I've listened to this podcast for 2 hours and I must go to Niagara. When would I want to go in order to have the most incredible experience?
Sure. That's a great question. So, without trying to make this, an ad read, right? Which is not necessarily the intent, but I guess, why not? So Niagara is open all year. There's reduced days of the year during the winter time because it's freaking cold there. But there's stuff happening all year long, right? So the flagship events in the summertime there's a Soldiers Through the Ages event, which happens Memorial Day weekend. And that's an awesome event where the fort highlights all the time periods. And so people come dressed and presenting history of darn near anything and everything. So that's one of my personal favorites. The fort also does a reenactment of that 1759 siege that we talked about. It's over 3 days, the 4th of July weekend. And if I'm not mistaken, it is the biggest event for that French and Indian War time period in the U.S. And then they also they rotate between a Revolutionary War event and a regular living history weekend event. This year with the 250th, the emphasis is on the Revolutionary War weekend, where they really highlight that Rev War history, right? So there'll be redcoats, there'll be Continentals, but there'll also be Indian Department, Native diplomacy presentations. So that is a big part of the history that Niagara does a very good job of owning, is the role of Native peoples specifically in the history of Fort Niagara. And then they've got a War of 1812 weekend, which is always a fun one. That's the summertime, but there are special events in the wintertime as well. One of my favorites is Castle by Candlelight. At night, turn off all the lights and just light candles everywhere. And so visitors can walk around the French castle in candlelight, and they'll see people cooking. They'll see the Jesuit priests in the chapel. You'll see French soldiers. So that's a fun one because it's a different perspective of the fort than you get kind of in the summertime. But yeah, that really did sound like an ad read. But yeah. Hey, why not?
And nothing wrong with that. Go check out Fort Niagara if you want to have an amazing historical experience.
That's it for this episode of Prime and Load. We hope you enjoyed us as much as we did. Don't forget to sign up for our free newsletter with the link in the description. It's the best way to stay up to date with the show, see what's coming up next, and ask us questions. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. This episode was hosted by Drs. Alexander Burns and Andrew Bamford. It was produced by Lee Gugino, music by Brianna Tam, Ardi Son, and Adrian Beringer. Prime and Load is a Historic Studios podcast.